Hello, students. This presentation is the last presentation for the course series on research methods. I'm doing this presentation as a means to perhaps give you better guidelines or supplemental guidelines for your final research methods presentation. So let me refer you to the on-screen document, Guidelines for Research Methods presentations. This is something that we went over in some detail during our last meeting, last in-group meeting. And if you'll remember that each student, we reviewed various articles relative to each student's interest and research goals, and then searched for and found an appropriate article, and that article was the one that you are to then use for your presentation at the end of the course. So let's go over this, and I'd like to review this a bit again, just to give you some more explicit guidelines if you need it. I would hope that you have already started this project now. But let's go over it again. So let's first of all look over the introduction, and where appropriate, I will also refer you back to some of the PowerPoints and other subject areas that we discussed that were meant for you to then insert, not the PowerPoints themselves, but for you to insert the knowledge that you gained relative to the discussions and the lectures. Anyway, let's start with the introduction. Now remember, these sections parallel the sections of any research article, APA-related research article. These are peer-reviewed articles that would go in a journal, and they are basically the same essential sections that you will use in a dissertation. Now, depending upon the criteria for your particular program, they may differ somewhat, but they are still the same basic ideas, the same basic criteria. So let's start with the introduction. So the introduction, now remember, you're going to read your article, read it carefully, read it again, even read it 3 times if possible, until you get the idea of what it's trying to get across. Now, I am not expecting you to be seasoned researchers or even readers of research. We haven't gone over enough for you to understand that, but we have gone over enough for you to address some of these issues, especially, and some of them more topically than others. This one, for example. So we start with the introduction. How well did the author define and address the problem area? Give examples. So there is some problem area which is reflected not only in the title but also the abstract of the article. And you should give a couple of examples relative to how they define and address the problem area. Now remember that the problem area shouldn't be loosely defined. It needs to be operationalized. And if you'll remember from our discussion of research, any area has to be operationalized so that any part of that can then be targeted for measurement, for some form of observation. So how well does the author define and address the problem area that they are researching? Secondly, does the particular research aim to define the problem area or provide solutions, one or the other? Perhaps there's a problem area that at this point is ill-defined or not defined, or maybe the author, the researchers want to further refine the problem area or seek another area, and or they may want to provide solutions. So either defining the problem area further or defining solutions, or both. C, how thoroughly does the author examine previous research? Now this, of course, is in the literature review. How do they thoroughly examine previous research? This is a very important part of any introduction, and usually occupies the majority of the introduction, and that the author is then, after they define the problem area uh, uh, and define what they're doing, then the author or authors then goes into examining what other research has been in this particular area. This is a matter of I'm doing this. How did somebody do it differently or similar? Again, it could be just replication. The research could be simply to replicate other researchers' findings. But anyway, you need to cite examples of those that research. And again, uh, uh, try to be a little more visual in doing these presentations. I understand that this is somewhat dry in citing the examples, but many authors, although they do cite an example, a simple Google search in areas or in images or videos or whatever, you'll probably find a wealth of other examples. How is this author's research different from any other research? Is it different? It is different. It is different how? First of all, it's different in that this author is doing it rather than whoever else did it. So it's different in that the researcher is different. Remember that we have two different types of validity. We have both internal and external validity. So the research number one is different because another researcher is doing it. Or it may be the same researcher who did similar research, but now she or he is looking at other areas of the same type of research. So look at how it may be different than other research in the same area. And 99 times out of 100, it's going to be different in some way, shape, or form than research in the other area. Then, last, what's the hypothesis, or what are the hypotheses of the research? And in this, you need to be very specific. Look at what are these hypotheses? What are the goals that the researcher or researchers are aiming to achieve, to answer a question or statement? What are those? And usually those are stated at the end of the introduction. So you're going to hit on all 5 of these topics. First of all, relative to your research article, the one that you were assigned the last time we met. Secondly, the methods section. Now, this section becomes a little more technical, and we covered this to some degree. Again, I'm not expecting you to be statisticians or testing and measurement experts in this. You're simply going to address these topically and relative to what we have studied. So the first question is the research experimental or non-experimental? And I believe that in almost all cases, remember, what are the primary criteria for an experiment? 3 things: that it has a control group, 1 thing; 2, that it has a pre-test and a post-test; and 3, that the groups were randomly assigned. So if it's experimental, what is the design? We didn't really talk much about experimental design, so if they state it, so state it. Sometimes they don't. And again, we didn't talk about all the different permutations and combinations of research design. So if that may not be applicable to what you're doing. If non-experimental, what is the research approach? And as I believe, some, if not all, of your projects were in fact non-experimental, and they were correlational. Correlational is finding correlation, and as you know, correlation doesn't necessarily mean cause. Is it a survey approach in which it's cross-sectional? They're hitting a number of different people at the same time, making one test, and then getting data based upon the distribution of the responses. Is it ex post facto, which is, in other words, is it just a post test? Are they doing looking for responses or reactions after a certain event? Then what is or are the independent variables. Okay, go back and look at what an independent variable is. I think that we talked about what independent variables are. We talked about bias, we talked about problem solving, evaluating web pages, and I believe that we also talked, I know we talked about data collection, research approaches, the research process which we're going through, different types of study designs, and then variables. So different types of variables, but primarily what is a independent versus dependent variable right here. So if you go into, I think it was the second PowerPoint discussion that we had, and I think we had these 1, 2, and 3 all in our first Saturday together. The independent variable is presumed to cause the change. The dependent variable is the effect. So by altering or manipulating the independent variable, you produce a change in the dependent variable. This is a cause and effect relationship. Okay, so what's the independent variable? So if it's a study of the change of depression, so you might use a therapy type, and then there may be a study then in therapy type, and what is most effective at reducing levels of depression. The independent variable would be therapy type. Let's say that psychodynamic therapy is used for one, cognitive behavioral therapy is used as another therapy type, and then there's a control group. So you have 3 therapy types: no therapy, cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic. The dependent variable would be the level or amount of depression that is changed relative to the different type of therapy. That would be the dependent variable. In that would be an example. Of course, you have to apply it to whatever your research subject matter is. How does the author address measurement validity and reliability issues of the measures used for the dependent and independent variables? Now, this is really important. For example, on the dependent variable side, if the researcher is measuring change in depression, then it's very important that they use a very reliable and valid measure of change. Now, you'll remember we talked in considerable detail about the different types of measurement validity. And in that, we talked about reliability of the measure, and that refers to the consistency or stability, and validity as well. So a measure has to be both reliable and valid in order to be used in a good experiment. Then we talked about the different types of reliability as well: test, retest, equivalent forms, the internal consistency. Almost all authors will use measures that report good internal consistency. What you need to remember is that it's a good idea to use gold standard measures. When one uses a gold standard measure, you really don't have to go into a lot of detail as to the level of reliability and validity for the study. For example, if I were measuring depression, given a range of mild to severely moderate, let's say mild to highly to moderate, highly moderate, not really severe, I would probably use the Beck Depression Inventory. It is the gold standard for measuring depression. But then again, the Hamilton would also be a likewise measure. If I'm measuring self-esteem, there's a number of gold standard measures for that. The Cooper-Smith, the Tennessee Self-Concept Scale, the Rosenberg Scale, lots of measures. So again, look at the measures that the author is using. You don't have to be familiar with the measure. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to make sure that you can read that the author is familiar with the measure, and that the author discusses the measure in terms of measures, usually in terms of their validity and reliability. That's what's most important. So this doesn't fall on you to know about the measure. It falls upon the author to know about the measure, and is the author reporting it in a manner that satisfies the reliability and validity constraints for the study. Who are the subjects and how are they selected? And again, who the subjects are and the method of selection and the method of assignment. Very important, because this eliminates, certainly it doesn't necessarily completely eliminate, but it goes to reduce any bias in a study and the selection criteria that they use. Methods section will always discuss the selection criteria of their participants. And also, what are the data collection techniques? How did they collect their data? How did they collect the data? For example, if it were the depression study I mentioned, are they collecting the data every 2 weeks over a 10-week period using a BDI that's filled out in the clinic? Is the data collected in a survey? Is the data collected at pre-test only? How's the data collected? So there's your methods section there. You want to address those issues. Then we get to the results. Now, again, many times, all the time, in fact, to comprehensively understand the results, you need to be fluent with statistical techniques. And so I'm not requiring you, nor does this presentation want you to go in any kind of statistical techniques. What I do want you to discuss is whether the author did. You don't have to understand what they did, but did they use tables? Did they use figures, graphs to display the findings? And again, they may have a bunch of figures and graphs and tables with terms and words and numbers and symbols to which you don't have a clue. That's fine. Simply indicate that they are indeed using the tables, figures, and graphs to a point that seems as if they are adequately displaying their findings from their research. Then secondly, because the whole point of all of this is to determine whether or not the hypotheses were confirmed. And I say here, right here, describe in detail, not in detail relative to some ANOVA results or MANOVA results or multiple regression results or anything like that. I don't mean for you to describe it in detail like that. I mean for you to describe what the authors say. So it's not you doing the analysis. The authors are doing the analysis. And you really don't even have to understand some of the words and jargon that they use, but simply, are they saying that the hypotheses were confirmed? And what is the basis for that argument? Or if they are not confirmed, then also we get into now the fourth part of this, the discussion section. So in this section, the authors many times will defer to the discussion section to also discuss hypothesis confirmation or disconfirmation. So one of the first things that they'll talk about is what are possible confounds in the study, because the discussion section is in fact a part where you say, hey, as much as we'd like the study to be perfect, no studies are perfect. Here's some of the things that you might consider could have gone wrong or did go wrong, especially if their hypotheses were not confirmed. So what are confounds? Remember, confounds, those are external forces that could change the results that affect the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Cite specific problems with the internal and external validity. So you guys remember that we've got different types of research validity. We talked about those in this section. And the four major types of research validity include, starting with one, statistical conclusion validity, which again, you're not being an expert, but did they include the statistics? Were the statistics included? Now, of course, if we were to get into this deeper, we would say, well, did they use the proper statistical tests in order to reach the conclusions that they used? I don't expect for you to know that. In fact, the study most likely would not have been published had they not. Then we get into construct validity. The construct validity is the whole idea of properly operationalizing the problem area itself. If they are studying, uh, let's say, autism, which is a huge area, what specifically are they studying? Are they studying the acquisition of social skills by high-functioning ASD teens between the ages of 13 and 16? That's a fairly well operationalized study. And we know exactly the population targeted, and we know the social skills. What we haven't learned, though, is based upon that developmental period of an individual, what particular social skills are there, and how do we measure them? That opens another whole can of worms. How do you measure social skills in that particular population in that particular age range? And of course, that would fall back to construct validity of the dependent measure. That is, how do you measure social skills and therefore change in social skills, and also in whatever the therapy methods that they are using to change social skills. Okay, so that would be construct validity. Internal validity is one's ability to say that the experiment was in fact valid. What are those? Those are threats to internal validity. Remember that those were history, testing, instrumentation, selection, statistical regression, experimental mortality, and maturation. Now, to this degree, I do want you to have some comprehension of what these mean. And you can certainly go over the PowerPoint, and the book goes over these in considerable detail. So read this, look at the study, and did they address threats to internal history, for example, or internal validity, for example, history? Could something have happened between pre-test and post-test, or during the course of the experiment, to individuals? Did they do something in order to change the results? Testing. Does repeated testing, if there is repeated testing, does that somehow change the outcome? Are they taking that into consideration? Instrumentation. Again, that goes back to good measures. If they used good measures, instrumentation probably isn't a problem. If they created their own measure, instrumentation is a problem. Then they need to have qualified their own measure, usually through some sort of a pilot test. And even that, there's still a problem of instrumentation. Selection, again, this goes to how the participants were selected and assigned. Selection is taking people out of a population, excuse me, and assignment is once you have those people from the population, how do you assign them into groups? And if they are assigned adequately, randomly, usually the selection issue isn't a problem. Statistical regression is that everybody in the group needs to be somewhat heterogeneous. If you have everybody at an extremely high level or an extremely low level of whatever your problem is, you're going to see regression to the mean. If everybody in your group, in a group, is highly depressed, even without treatment, you're going to see a reduction in depression over time. Experimental mortality is really simply attrition. Do people drop out? What is important to consider is what is different about people who drop out versus people who stay in. So you need to be diligent relative to these threats to internal validity. Internal validity is what? One's ability to say that indeed changes in the independent variable cause the change in the dependent variable. Okay, so cite problems with internal and external validity. How does the author adequately explain any shortcomings of the research, in which they do? Every piece of research has shortcomings. Does the author adequately summarize the findings of the study? That really shouldn't require much explanation. You read it and see if the findings of the study are summarized. And most authors will indeed go into a good summary of the findings, especially if their hypotheses were met. And if they weren't confirmed, or the ones that weren't confirmed, they'll also go into the reasons possibly why they weren't confirmed, which would also be tied back to the shortcomings. Does the author replicate any other research or discover new or different findings? This is very important. Replication is one of the hallmarks in theory building. So if more and more studies replicate findings, then this even lends to the strength of a given theory. And if new or different findings are discovered, that too then lends to theory building, in that the theory may be expanded or discarded. In the author's opinion, where's the future research in this topic? Now, the discussion section is really the only place where you can vent your opinion. At no other part of any research can you offer your opinion. But in the discussion section, yes, you can venture outside those lines a bit and offer your opinion, especially where you believe the future research is going, especially if you yourself intend to carry it out. And in your own opinion, and this is now is asking for you, your special opinions, your specific opinion. Now, you, the presenter, you, the student, where's the future of this research in this topic? Because clearly, if you chose this area of research and this particular article that we searched for you in class the last Saturday we were together, where do you believe the future of this research is? And here's a point where you can now interject the type of research that you want to do in this area and where you think that might go. And then last is, were the references adequately and appropriately listed? And again, if this is published research, you know that the references were adequately and appropriately listed. You might want to show just a paste out of some of the references that were shown and the number of references that were used. Most of the references will be tied to the literature review and previous research, which is here. How thoroughly does the author examine previous research? So a lot of the literature review will be tied to there, or to the methods section, where they'll cite how previous research used this method or that method and these variables and these particular measures and so on. And you would also cite articles that cite the psychometrics. What is psychometrics? Psychometrics are the measurement qualities of any independent or dependent variable, like the psychometrics of the Beck Depression Inventory, the psychometrics of the State Trait Anxiety Inventory, and so on and so forth. Psychometrics include who it was standardized on, what is the mean in a non-clinical population, what is the mean in a specific clinical population. Let's say that I'm measuring the BDI in a clinical population, then and that clinical population is in an inpatient population for major depressive disorder. The mean, that standard mean for the BDI might be 52 plus or minus whatever standard deviation. If it is a clinical population in an outpatient setting, where people are simply going to therapy once or twice a week, that would be another mean, versus a non-clinical population, that is just people that are not in therapy, that are just picked up off the street. I say that tongue in cheek. What would the mean be? And generally that mean would be 10 and under. So I hope that this gives you a little better handle as to how to do this presentation, which these presentations, which I'm very much looking forward to seeing. And we will be commencing these this coming Saturday. So at any rate, if you have any other issues or problems, please email me and otherwise I will see you next Saturday. Y'all take